Hello, Duane.
Hello.
How are you? How are you today?
I'm great. How are you doing?
Doing great, thanks. How's Mumbai?
Uh, it's unusually humid and hot. And
Unusually, really?
uh, no, not unusually. But you know, I was living in Pune before I came here, and this level of humidity I tend not to feel until the summer. And here you feel it also in the winter when you're in Mumbai for some reason.
Right. So, well, I think it's about 5 degrees or 6 degrees here in Ontario, and we are not struggling with the humidity whatsoever. However, I, I I said to my wife this morning, perhaps that's a good thing that the weather is miserable outside and gloomy because it is not nearly as inviting. So it helps us to stay inside, staying inside just a little bit more palatable. So tell us, because I'm sure that most people don't know who you are within my network anyway. So I'd like you to introduce yourself to the listeners, and where are you and what are you up to?
So my name is Duane Rousselle. I'm calling from Mumbai, hence the Hindu statue of Lord Ganesha over my left shoulder, where I'm working as an associate professor of psychology at NMIMS, which is a university, quite popular university in the major part of Mumbai. I guess a little bit about me is that I've worked as a professor, an author. I've authored quite a few books now and articles, and I worked as a clinical psychoanalyst for quite a few years. I stopped my practice when I came to India, but it's something I continue to study and research and publish on.
Nice. And we were at Bay Ridge just briefly together before you got the opportunity to go more to the academic side. And it was there where we connected. And I felt like that we had a really good, unique connection. And so even though you have gone to the other side of the planet, I thought it would be really great to reach out to you and to continue the discussion. And I think you bring a very different type of perspective to what we're going through based on your life experience and your geographical experience. And I felt perhaps that this might be some good insight for Canadians, but also maybe for people around the world. So how are you personally dealing with this challenge of quarantine and some of the restrictions that we as a world have been having to deal with?
Personally, I think it's. I picked up this argument from one of my former academic mentors, professor now at UCLA, so I can't take full credit for it. But I think that it's important for those of us who work in clinical fields, but also those of us who are leaders in various areas, whether that means teachers working in politics or whatever else, to adopt a little, let's say, humility and recognize that other people want to see us and hear us talk about our vulnerabilities. And so, so on that note, I would say that I think I'm having a difficult time with it, just like everybody else. It's affecting my sleep schedule, which I can't seem to get on track. I've regressed into old circadian rhythms. It's produced in me a certain level of generalized anxiety that I think a lot of people are feeling now, but it's also brought with it some perspective. With confinement, I think it's forced me to confront things in my life that I hadn't realized I should have been confronting. Issues having to do with spirituality, issues having to do with questions regarding my own finitude and my relationships to others that I may have taken for granted. So personally, I've returned to some of these issues in my own life. So my situation in Mumbai is probably quite different than in Canada, because the structure of the social bond here is, as many people know, it's fundamentally different than what people are familiar with in Canada. You know, Canada is a geographical context where you have spaces, even in cosmopolitan areas, you have spaces between homes, between people. And here there's a lot of crowding, and so social distancing is a privilege, particularly among those at the top of the caste and class hierarchies. So I happen to have the privilege of being able to distance myself, but if I look out my window, I see that there are a lot of people who don't have that privilege.
Thank you for your vulnerability in admitting that. I think it's important for our viewers and people to realize, just because you're a psychoanalyst or a psychotherapist or a psychologist or a psychiatrist, it does not mean that we are above the difficulty of the moment. It is definitely impacting all of us in very different, in different ways, but certainly in very real ways.
And this is a point of identification between, let's say, patient and analyst or therapist. It's a way to form a bond with one another by saying, you know, I'm also affected by this, and it's okay that we don't have to be strong all the time and show other people that we are strong and that we can, that somehow we have some astute ability to make it through this while others do not, which is not true. The only difference is that with humility comes the ability to work through the issues. When you admit that you're feeling anxiety, when you admit that you're confronting issues, then you're better equipped to work through those issues, I think, than those who deny it and perhaps want to appear as a hero or something.
I think there's wisdom that comes from acknowledgement.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. And what are you noticing yourself acting differently, or of course there are restrictions, you know, being imposed upon you and upon society, but what are you noticing that's different? You were telling me a few days ago an interesting story about the traffic in Mumbai.
Yeah, well, I guess I would separate this into two answers. One has to do with what I'm noticing outside of myself that's different, and the other is something that I'm noticing different here within my personal private life. Outside in Mumbai, we are known, and this is all of India, we are known for being a culture of traffic. There's just swarms and swarms of cars, rickshaws, all interweaving within this sort of giant cacophony of beings that are just trying to get somewhere. And they're constantly negotiating their space and where they're going. But one of the consequences of that is that you tend to hear horns honking all the time. And the horns have been honking from morning until night without fail. And it doesn't matter what time of the day or night it is, you will hear horns. And the horns can be heard from every corner of the, and I don't mean this to be hyperbole, of every corner of the country.
Yeah.
For the first time since the horns began, we're not hearing them anymore. It's the first time that people are noticing quiet outside. We're not hearing people shouting. All you can hear, and it depends on where you're situated, is the azan, the Islamic call to prayer, which are still being conducted, but now they're being conducted for people to pray in their homes, rather than in the masjid. And you can still hear sometimes the sound, the religious Hindu music in some of the temples, although nobody's going to visit the temples. But other than that, it's oddly very eerie quietness outside.
I've heard that in the Himalayas, they can actually see the Himalayas for the first time in many, many years due to the lowering of the pollution. So here you have visual or air pollution, but also the lowering of noise pollution as well. And I was reading in Vienna how the water in the waterways is actually the cleanest it's been in years. So, you know, we've talked about the amount of lessons to be learned through all of this and trying to find somewhat of a silver lining. And it certainly is interesting how the world and the earth seems to be recovering by our stillness. That seems like a whole conversation that we could get into at another time. And I do want to honor your time, Duane. So I was thinking about some things that you, in your circumstance, your situation, your context, what are you doing for yourself that may be able to be helpful to other people who find themselves dealing with some similar types of struggles that you're going through?
Yeah, I think one of the basic things that we all tend to do in times like this is and I want to be honest, I've talked to a lot of clinicians and they've found that a lot of the patients that they've been seeing are showing remarkable signs of recovery now.
Yeah.
For example, those who suffered from paranoia now say, well, everybody's paranoid. And so they feel a sense of comfort, you know.
All of it together.
Yeah, but I think one of the things I started doing was creating little rituals in my life,
okay,
which I think are ultimately unsustainable, but they do offer temporary relief. Saying I'm going to do this at that time, I'm going to have a meeting with this person at that particular time, or I'm going to do this tomorrow. And I think it's really important because at a moment like this, we start to forget how time functions and we get plunged into a sort of traumatic moment of infinity or eternity. We think we're in this forever. And so simply to create these symbolic coordinates, which are what I'm calling ritual, they can help us remember that there is an after. And when the after comes, we'll look back and we'll say, do you remember when?
Yeah.
And when we can have an understanding that there's still a logical process to time, it can help us maintain a sense of calm and sanity, that it's not going to be like this forever. So that's one of the things I've been doing. Another thing I think I've been doing, and we've all been a part of this as well, to a greater or lesser extent, is as a way to cope, because one of the problems that we're ultimately having is that our social bonds seem to have been weakened. It's harder to relate to people, especially if you are like I am, completely isolated in a country and in a city where you basically know absolutely nobody. It necessitates a moment of reinvention where you have to invent new ways to relate to one another.
Reinvention.
Yeah, and I think invention is a hot word, and I'm starting to hear this signifier, this word circulating more and more in stories that I'm reading on the internet. We're forced to invent new modes of relating to other people, and ultimately that ends up being through telephone, through Zoom, through Skype, through Facebook, through textual mediums, like writing diaries or journals. I started writing a diary on my online. Like every other day, whether it's writing a letter to my son, a letter to myself, a letter to nobody. These are ways I think that we can cope with it. Finally, I would say it's when you feel the anxiety, whatever the source of that anxiety. For me, it's a little bit of, let's call it hypochondria, feeling forced into a small space for an extended period of time. I think it's important to explore it, not alone, but to call a friend or call a family member or a mentor or somebody who can act as a sounding board and allow you to explore your anxieties through words, to talk about them and formulate them into language so that you can see why you feel this way. And hopefully you can work through it in a way that you couldn't. So this is one of the gifts of the silver linings of our unfortunate situation that we're in now is that we're forced to confront anxieties that we've always had before,
Right.
but now we can't ignore them.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we can't ignore them, let's take advantage of that and work through it.
Yeah.
And so this is something I've been doing as well, and I would recommend other people to do.
Okay. That could take some time and some real thoughtfulness. And I love the idea of journaling. I am a big proponent of writing things down. It just makes things much more tangible when you write your fears down, and you can disempower them a lot more when you've identified them, rather than let them be these mystical ghosts that really have no certainty to them.
Yeah, it's like there's something about words. It's like they can dig into the anxiety, and they can sort of tranquilize it.
Yeah.
So I always used to say this to my son. We always say to children, use your words. But I say you can exchange your anxieties for words, and we're really resistant to that as a species. You know, when something's when we're really at an emotional deadlock, we often don't want to say something.
Right.
And there's a certain trauma.
Like we make it real.
We make it real. That's exactly it. And so
that's the exact thing that we need to do to be able to overcome it, is to make it real, to acknowledge the realness of it.
That's right.
It's quite counterintuitive.
Yeah.
Good. Those are some really good thoughts. Some really good thoughts. So many questions to ask you, and I'm afraid that if I ask too many questions, we'll be here for a long time. I feel like maybe we should pick up another day and continue the conversation. Would you be okay with that?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, good. Okay. So then in the end, so let's wrap up with this one last question then, about our mindset, and about, you know, the idea of how we view things, how we view our circumstances. So do you think that there is a specific mindset that you've had to adopt in order to prepare yourself or strengthen yourself to get through this time?
I'm not sure that I adopted a particular mindset. I know when it first began, I think I responded to it in the same way that a lot of others have, in a sort of disbelief, and I started challenging the circumstances. You know, everybody was saying stay in. It wasn't an official lockdown in India. We have the biggest lockdown in the world, and they just renewed it for another, I think, 20 days. So, I mean, I've been in my apartment now for almost 2 months, I think. It's been a long time. And
wow.
And it may be, has it been 2 months, maybe a month and a half, and it may still be another month, and then they're going to adopt a sort of staggered exit.
Yeah.
So at first it was disbelief, and I still kind of went out, and I went out in the streets and with my face mask, and a lot of it at that time was also dealing with what I thought were other people's paranoia and irrationality. For example, because I'm a foreign national, I was kind of interrogated in my apartment by members of my condo society, asking me if I've traveled. They wanted to see my passport. They wanted proof that I didn't have COVID, and so on, because I was the only foreign national in the area. So there's a lot of that. And then when it started to become real, as you put it earlier, I think at first I started turning to spirituality a little bit. I started going back to various religious texts and various religious traditions, and trying to find some wisdom in that. And then after that, I think I just sort of made peace with it and started my routines, started having regular meetings with people on the telephone and on Zoom. Started engaging more with my students who now, I mean, working from home is actually harder than working from the office, because now people contact me from morning until sometimes 4 in the morning. They'll be messaging me or calling me. And so I find myself even busier than I was before. And so I think a part of it is part of my mindset that's been the most productive has been to just really stay busy, stay focused on projects, stay focused on writing. And for me, I've been pushing to the side, watching silly movies, although that can be therapeutic for some people too. For me, I don't think it works very well. Yeah, so that's basically what I've been doing.
Okay. As you were talking, it kind of reminds me of what we would talk about, the stages to, or the cycle of grief, where we go through the shock, the shock of the trauma. And is this real? Is this really happening? And there's those moments where we are trying to make sense of it and going, is this really true? Is this not really true? Who do I believe? What is a reputable source? And there's that confusing moment. And then we move into that accepting stage of, now, yes, I'm going to accept that this is real. And now I have to start to make some changes in how I see my world, how I see my life, how I see my circumstances. It's an interesting comparison.
Yeah, but I think it says something about the human condition. It
Yeah.
says immediately we're not immediately capable often of responding to the truth, of taking responsibility for the truth. We always have to pass through some sort of phase. It can be an extended phase of non-encountering the truth, until we can reach a period where we can finally find a way to confront it. And often that moment is when you go to see a therapist. It's a moment of crisis often, is when somebody finally says, oh, please help me, but not before. It's like there's a wall there in time that's erected to separate us from the truth. And we have to pass through it at some point.
That's funny. That reminds me of working with a lot of couples. A lot of couples don't go for counseling until it's like one person is ready to leave, and then they realize, oh, there actually is a problem. Okay, we better go see somebody. I'm now willing to admit that this is a problem, even though it has been a problem for the last 15 years.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's often the way. Crisis is a moment. It's a moment of pain, but it's also a moment of truth. And it's a moment for us to reflect upon a truth that has always been here. I mean, the sort of circumstances that are related to coronavirus, our inability to respond to crisis, our inability to build structures of resilience, our inability to form solidarity with the most vulnerable populations in our world and in our societies and communities. These are things we could have always been doing. But it always takes a crisis for us to really see that truth in its naked form.
Yes. So let's hope then, Duane, that through this, that could be one of the silver linings, is it does spur us on or cause us to take notice of the things that weren't working and to address them and to change them.
Absolutely.
Yeah. This has been really good. I look forward to having another chat with you again soon. And then maybe we can continue on with this conversation, because I think the mine is a lot deeper than we chose to dig today. That's for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Kevin.
So you stay safe, stay cool, stay hydrated, and and we'll talk again soon. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you. I look forward to it.
Thank you so much.